It was a crisp autumn morning in Cedar Creek, a picturesque residential neighborhood in Virginia, when my cousin, General Daniel Carter, returned from a 6-month mission overseas. He had served in the U.S. Army for over 20 years, leading operations across the globe, but nothing could prepare him for the conflict awaiting him at home. As he drove down the familiar tree-lined streets toward his house, he noticed something was wrong. The neighborhood looked the same. The neatly trimmed lawns, the white picket fences, the American flags waving gently in the wind. But when he reached his destination, he slammed on the brakes, his heart racing. His home, an elegant 2-story colonial-style house that had been in our family for decades, was gone. In its place stood a barren patch of earth, tire tracks, and the skeletal beginnings of a new construction project. The sight made his stomach clench, but the sign posted at the front sent a wave of cold fury through him. Future site of Cedar Creek. Clubhouse, a development by Homeowner Association. The Homeowner Association had demolished his house. Daniel's hands gripped the steering wheel as a deep simmering anger boiled inside him. His home wasn't just a building, it was his sanctuary, his family's legacy, and the place he had planned to retire after a lifetime of service to his nation. He threw the car into park, barely remembering to shut the engine off before storming toward the Homeowner Association office at the heart of the community. The office, a sleek and modern structure that stood in stark contrast to the traditional homes around it, housed the board members who had ruled Cedar Creek with an iron fist for years. As he pushed through the glass doors, the receptionist, a nervous-looking woman in her 50s, glanced up in shock. "Sir, do you have an appointment?" she stuttered, but Daniel was already moving past her. He marched down the hall, following the sound of chatter and clinking coffee cups, until he reached the meeting room, where the Homeowner Association board held their weekly gatherings. The moment he stepped inside, the talk died. 5 well-dressed figures sat around a polished wooden table, looking up in surprise. At the head of the table was Richard Wallace, the Homeowner Association chairman, a smug, silver-haired man in his 60s who had long been known for his harsh enforcement of Homeowner Association policies. He leaned back in his seat, regarding Daniel with mild amusement. "Ah, Mr. Carter, what a surprise," he said smoothly. "To what do we owe the honor?" Daniel's fists tightened at his sides as he stepped closer. "What the hell happened to my residence?" he demanded, his voice low but seething with barely contained rage. Wallace exchanged a glance with the other board members before sighing as if dealing with a stubborn child. "We sent multiple notices regarding the Cedar Creek expansion project," he said in a patronizing tone. "Your property was reallocated." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "You demolished my home without my approval." Wallace smirked. "Well, technically, it was in the fine print of the Homeowner Association contract you signed years ago. We had the legal right to reclaim certain homes for community development." Daniel's jaw clenched so tightly it ached. He had fought enemies on foreign lands, but now he faced a different kind of battle, one covered in legal loopholes, corruption, and bureaucratic arrogance. But Wallace had made a serious mistake, he thought. Daniel Carter was just another resident, just another name on a list. What he didn't know was that Daniel had spent his entire life leading troops into battle, dismantling enemy networks, and overcoming impossible challenges. And now he was about to bring a storm to the Homeowner Association's doorstep. Daniel didn't waste time arguing. He knew that shouting at Wallace wouldn't bring his property back, and he wasn't about to let the Homeowner Association trap him in legal jargon and excuses. Instead, he pulled out his phone and made a single call. Within hours, Colonel Mark Reynolds, an old ally and a military legal specialist, arrived in Cedar Creek. Mark had spent years dealing with complex military agreements, land conflicts, and government legal cases. If anyone could dismantle the Homeowner Association's so-called legal defense, it was him. The two men sat in Daniel's temporary lodging, a small but comfortable apartment on the other side of town, sifting through every document they could find. Daniel had kept meticulous records of his ownership, Homeowner Association communications, and every fee he had ever paid. Mark cross-checked these with the county's property files, and what he found was shocking. The home Owner association hadn't just used a vague loophole to take Daniel's house, they had forged documents, manipulated files, and pushed through an illegal change that gave them the power to seize specific residences for community projects. Worse, there was money involved. A real estate developer had been funneling bribes to Wallace and his inner circle, ensuring that certain homes, especially older ones with prime locations, were taken and converted for high-profit projects. Daniel's property had been a target from the beginning. The more they dug, the more corruption they uncovered. Cedar Creek wasn't just a community with a strict homeowner association. It was a real estate empire, built on fear, deceit, and corruption. Residents who questioned the board were hit with outrageous penalties. Some had even been forced to sell their properties under threats of repossession. It was a well-oiled scheme designed to keep control in the hands of a few, and Daniel had just become the biggest danger to their operation. But he wasn't just interested in getting his residents back. He wanted to take the entire system down. Over the next few days, Daniel and Mark gathered every piece. To a reporter he had once assisted overseas, the story was about to go public. But that wasn't all. Daniel had one more strategy to play, one that the homeowner association never saw coming. He wasn't just a resident. He was a high-ranking US Army officer with direct access to federal law enforcement agencies. And once those agencies got involved, there would be no escape for Wallace and his conspirators. A week later, the Cedar Creek Homeowner Association held a lavish, groundbreaking event for their new clubhouse. It was supposed to be a moment of celebration, a public display of their so-called vision for the community. The event was held right on the plot where Daniel's home once stood. A platform had been set up, complete with decorations, catering, and a gathering of residents who had been coerced into attending. At the center of it all stood Richard Wallace, dressed in an expensive suit, smiling for the cameras as he prepared to deliver a speech about progress and development. But just as he stepped up to the podium, the sound of rumbling engines echoed through the neighborhood. The crowd turned their heads as a convoy of military Humvees rolled onto the property, their tires kicking up dust as they came to a halt. A dozen soldiers in full uniform stepped out, forming a line as a figure emerged from the lead vehicle, General Daniel Carter. His presence alone was enough to command silence. Wallace's face went pale as Daniel marched toward the stage, his expression unreadable. Behind him, Colonel Mark Reynolds and several federal agents followed, carrying documents filled with evidence. Daniel didn't need a microphone. His voice was enough to cut through the tension. "This ceremony is over," he declared, his eyes locked on Wallace. "You're all under investigation for fraud, illegal property seizure, and embezzlement." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The journalists, who had come expecting a promotional piece, immediately turned their cameras toward the unfolding confrontation. Homeowner Association board members looked at each other in fear, some instinctively backing away, but there was nowhere to run. Wallace forced a grin, attempting to hold his composure. "Now hold on a second," he said, raising a palm. "There's no need for exaggeration, General Carter. We followed legal protocols." "You forged signatures," Daniel interrupted firmly. "You took bribes. You forced people out of their residences and destroyed houses under false claims. We have the files, the financial records, and witness testimonies to prove it." One of the officers stepped forward and handed Wallace an official document. "Richard Wallace, you are officially served with a federal subpoena. You and your board members are required to cooperate with an ongoing investigation into fraud and corruption." The last trace of arrogance drained from Wallace's face. The other members whispered among themselves, realizing that their control was slipping through their hands. A few tried to object, but the arrival of local police sealed their fate. Officers moved in, seizing homeowner association documents while shocked residents watched. The once untouchable board members collapse under the weight of their crimes. The groundbreaking ceremony had turned into a public reckoning, and there was no way out. Wallace clenched his fists, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "You think you've won?" He spat at Daniel. "This is my neighborhood. I built this place." Daniel took a step closer, his presence imposing. "No," he said calmly. This was never yours to steal. And now, you're going to pay for what you've done. The battle was over. But the consequences were just beginning. Within days, the Cedar Creek Homeowner Association collapsed under the weight of lawsuits and criminal charges. The investigation revealed years of deception, fraudulent financial dealings, and illegal property seizures that extended far beyond Daniel's case. Residents who had been forced out of their homes came forward with their own stories, and with the mounting evidence, the state attorney general's office moved quickly. Richard Wallace and several board members were arrested, charged with fraud, conspiracy, and destruction of private property. Their assets were frozen, their reputation destroyed, and their influence shattered. The once powerful homeowner association, which had ruled the neighborhood with intimidation and greed, was now nothing more than a warning. The Cedar Creek Clubhouse project was immediately canceled, and the land where Daniel's house once stood was returned to him. But there was nothing left of his home, just a vacant lot, filled with rubble and broken promises. For most people, this would have been the end of the fight. But Daniel wasn't like others. He wasn't just interested in reclaiming what was his. He wanted to ensure no one else would ever go through what he did. Using his military connections and the legal team that had helped bring down the homeowner association, Daniel pushed for government intervention. Within weeks, Cedar Creek was placed under independent supervision, stripping the homeowner association of its control. New rules were introduced ensuring that no homeowners association could ever misuse its power the way Wallace's had. The community was finally free. But even with justice served, Daniel still had to rebuild. That's when something amazing happened. Word of his struggle had spread beyond Cedar Creek veterans organizations. Military support groups and even complete strangers reached out offering their assistance. Soldiers he had served with, residents who had once feared speaking up, and volunteers from across the region came together to help him restore. It wasn't just about putting up walls and a roof. It was about reclaiming something that had been stolen from him. Donations flooded in, construction teams worked around the clock, and within months, a new house stood where his old one had been. But this wasn't just any home. It was stronger, more modern, and built with the hands of people who believed in justice, loyalty, and community. The wounds of the past remained, but in their place stood something even greater, a symbol of strength, proof that one man could stand up against corruption and win. A year later, Daniel stood on the porch of his new home drinking coffee as the sun rose over Cedar Creek. The breeze was crisp, the kind of morning that reminded him of why he had always loved this place. But it wasn't just the house that had changed. It was the entire community. Without the oppressive rule of the homeowner association, Cedar Creek had evolved. The fear that once lingered in the eyes of residents was gone, placed with a sense of unity and freedom. Families no longer worried about unfair fines for minor violations, and homeowners could finally make choices about their own properties without interference. What had once been a battlefield of bureaucracy and corruption was now a thriving, self-governed neighborhood. Mark pulled into the driveway and stepped out, holding a newspaper in one hand and a smile on his face. "You made the headline again," he said, handing it over. Daniel glanced at the title, Homeowner Association. Tyrants brought to justice by us Army General. He laughed, shaking his head. "Not exactly the kind of battle I expected to fight, but I'll take the win." Mark grinned. "And you set a standard. Other neighborhoods across the nation are challenging their homeowner associations. Now, some states are even revising their laws because of this situation." Daniel sighed, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. What started as a personal battle had turned into something bigger, something that had helped people. Far beyond Cedar Creek, he looked out at the community, watching kids ride their bicycles down the street, an elderly couple caring for their garden without worry of being fined for unapproved vegetation, and neighbors conversing happily over their fences. This was what a neighborhood was supposed to be. He had spent his life fighting for liberty overseas, but this battle had taught him that sometimes the threat wasn't in a distant country. It was right at home, hidden behind contracts, loopholes, and authoritarian, power-hungry officials. But no matter where the fight was, he had proven that fairness always found a way. Mark leaned against the balcony, railing, folding his arms. So what now? Daniel took another sip of his coffee, a slow smile forming. Now, I finally enjoy my residence. He had fought, he had won, and now, at long last, he was at ease. Daniel took a deep breath, letting the cool morning air fill his lungs as he gazed out at the neighborhood he had fought so hard to protect. Cedar Creek was no longer a place ruled by fear and deception. It was a true community built on resilience and fairness. He had faced powerful enemies on the warfront, but this fight had been just as crucial. As he stood on his new porch, coffee in hand, he knew one thing for certain: no matter where the struggle was, doing what's right would always be worth it. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible tales of fairness, resilience, and unexpected payback. Your support helps bring more stories like this to life.